Now the acid test would be, have Ganna ride an IP on the Pinarello, give him a few hours rest, give him a bit of pasta, maybe a bit of San Pellegrino and a bit of Chianti, then do the same IP, same air density on the Lotus, on the Hocus Pocus, and then there's your acid test. So hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now it seems like we've been waiting ages for the track events to start at the Olympics. If you haven't seen my video I did recently on the men's individual time trial and the tech analysis behind that, I'll leave a link in the description to that, or I'll put a card here or here somewhere. Be sure to check that out. But like I said, track events just started today, so it seems like a great time to talk about the Lotus and Hope Team GB bike. Now that's actually been around for a while now. They kind of released the design, I think end of 2019 or maybe 2020, I don't know. We've had a fair while to test it, a fair while to get it right and sort out the 3D printed parts and make sure they don't snap, just like the Aussie ones do. And yeah, it seems like it's the most radical thing that we've seen in the velodrome probably in the last 10 years. Now let's have a little look at the content of this video. Stay tuned, give us a like and subscribe if you like this kind of thing, and let me know in the comments if you got any suggestions for further videos based on the track events. Try and keep it as brief as possible and as layman as possible. Number one, we're going to look at the different aero philosophies and tenets of the different nationalities and what squads are bringing what, and we're going to look at, are they focusing on the bike or are they focusing on the rider and bike package, and we're going to get really geeky in terms of that. We're going to look at a bit of theory. We're going to have to visit a bit of theory, unfortunately, to understand something about the Hocus Pocus, Hope Lotus, Locus, Hope Lotus bike. Yeah, so we need to look about flow around cylinders. That's quite important to understand if you're going to understand the principles behind the Hope bike. Then we're going to look at Reynolds number a little bit. It's a bit geeky, vortex streaks and wakes and all that good stuff. And then we're going to look at how the Lotus bike implements that theory into its quite radical design and why it looks so, some say ugly, some say beautiful. Now after you look at that bike and you realise what theory they're trying to hit, and you look back to a normal bike which is kind of more bike centric CDA focused, you realise actually like that looks really old fashioned, but we'll come on to that. Beauty is in the eye of and all that. And then we're going to look at slightly weird controversial IP issue around this bike which no one really seems to have picked up on. So let's get into it. First of all, before we look at the Hope and Lotus, I can't really say it, Hocus, we'll just call it Hocus Pocus. Before we look at the Hocus Pocus bike, let's have a look at some of the other offerings that the other, hitters, the other really good nations are bringing. Start off with the Pinarello, the M-A-A-T, the Mart. I don't know how you pronounce it, but I would say that's more of a traditional track bike design ethos. If you look at the picture of Ganna riding it here, it's all about low frontal area, low CDA of the bike itself. That's all very well. A horse race with no jockeys, that would probably win. All the tube shapes, yeah, we can see here are aero profiled for the bike only. Not much to say about it really, it's just kind of what we've seen for the last 10 years, just reducing the CDA of the bike alone. Okay, there's probably some parts of the bike that do interact with the rider's CDA to work with that, but it doesn't seem that apparent. It looks great. Pinarello are a big brand. They're a mass market brand, they need to sell bikes, and it looks kind of like there's something you could buy like the Bolide TT bike, and that is always in the back of their mind. With the Hocus Pocus bike, Hope don't make road bikes, no they don't yet anyway, and Lotus certainly don't make road bikes. A few of the other offerings here, we've got the Works bike, which is actually a UK designed and engineered bike, and that's the Malaysian track team bike. Again, it's very narrow frontal area, 80mm tubes, so maxed out on the UCI rule. Narrow dropouts again. This bike's got 32mm dropouts on the front forks. Now we consider like a normal road bike's got 100mm OLD. This is 32. Everything's about super narrow, low wetted area, small frontal area, low CDA. Of the bike, that seems to be a theme, doesn't it? The Koga is a bit more interesting because the Netherlands seem to use big frames, right? Even you look at their girls on the team sprint and the team pursuit, they're all on big frames with not much seat post sticking out. So that's a bit more kind of rider and bike package focused. They seem to be using the frame maybe a bit more as a splitter plate between the two legs of the rider. Maybe that's why they go for big frames. But that's just a recap of some of the other offerings. But in general, I would say you put them in the wind tunnel next to the Hocus Pocus bike, they will have a lower CDA without a rider. Really deep 80mm aerofoils, lower frontal area than the Hope. And if you just look at the frontal profile of the Hocus Pocus bike, it's just got way more frontal area. There's a lot more surfaces there, there's more aerofoils there, there's loads more stagnation points, and it doesn't seem that good when a rider's not sitting on it. Now, the design ethos of the Hope and Lotus package is, well, it is a rider and bike package, so it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Why have we been ignoring the rider for so long when designing a bike frame? And that's why it kind of looks like it does, and it looks a little bit ugly. But you can look at the Pinarello and say that looks sleek and sexy and beautiful from the front, and it's almost like no frontal area. But the bike doesn't ride around the velodrome without a rider. So why not use the bike frame, manipulate the surfaces of the bike frame to lower the CDA of the big bluff body elements that is the rider. So that's the hips, the calves, the thighs, the shoes, everything really. Why leave that exposed outside of the small frontal area of the frame when you can use parts of that? Okay, we're getting close to technical infringement because you can't actually fare the limbs of the rider, but there are things you can do, as we'll see with a Hope bike, and that's the ethos of the Hope bike. So the Hope bike ethos is rider and bike package. It seems like the ethos of the other bikes are bike package. It looks great on the screen, the marketing looks great, but it doesn't go around the velodrome without a rider. So that's the route Hope and Lotus have gone down. And don't forget, they don't sell road bikes, so there's no real conflict of interest. They don't really care if their bike is ugly, but it might be fast. Now, the acid test would be, have Ganna ride an IP on the Pinarello, give him a few hours rest, give him a bit of pasta, maybe a bit of San Pellegrino and a bit of Chianti, then do the same IP, same air density on the Lotus, on the Hocus Pocus, and then there's your acid test. Okay, it's better than kind of wind tunnel and all that crap. But unfortunately for the GB guys, we know they're not as strong as the Danes in the IP and the Team Pursuit. Comparing these nation to nation is not a great test of the bike, and GB won't give us any data on the old bike versus the new one really. So to watch these events unfold, it's going to be difficult to attribute any victories to the bike alone because we don't have any sort of back-to-back testing with the same rider. Anyway, those are the kind of two aero tenets discussed between the opposition and the GB bike. Now, to understand how the Hope bike works, we need to understand a little bit of theory. So moving on, we need to realise, and if you're a cyclist and you know a little bit about aerodynamics or you're into TTs, you need to probably know, or you probably do know already, that flow around a cylinder, so arm, legs, torso, depending on how many beers you've had, thighs, calves, everything, we can approximate those as cylinders, or they're not, because when you're pedaling, the angle of inclination to the free stream changes, so you can get like elliptical shapes, or you can get spherical parts around parts of the shoe and ankle, or you can get, you know, cylinders where your leg is straight. Flow around cylinders isn't very good. They're not streamlined objects, and the bike can be a streamlined object, but the rider, you're not allowed to do anything with that. You can't fare your legs, you can't put aerofoil sections on your legs, it's against the rules. So that gives you the most drag on a bike. It's your body, and the legs, and mainly the torso and the legs, are kind of the worst parts really. And what can we do to improve the flow around cylinders? Well, with the rider's body, they've outlawed, you know, dimples on skin suits and things like that. Any mechanical raising of the skin by adding on, you know, little dimples or vortex generators, we can't do that. That's all been banned. We can't mechanically fare the limbs, that's been banned. So why not use the bike frame? And that's what Hope have done. So flow around cylinders, depending on something called Reynolds number, the nature of the flow around the cylinder changes. Now, flow around cylinders can be characterized into kind of 5 or 6 different flow regimes really, or as many as you like, it depends on how many points you want. But a very low, what we call Reynolds numbers, where like the airspeed is very, very low. I mean, there are other things that affect Reynolds number, like density, viscosity, and, you know, the size of the cylinder. But in terms of cycling, when we keep those parts the same, to vary the Reynolds number, we're just talking about basically speed. So if the airspeed is very low, there are regimes where the flow can almost remain attached around the cylinder. But at the Reynolds number that we see in cycling, something like 700,000 for these kind of cylinders, you don't need to worry about the number, it's a dimensionless number really. We get these things called vortex streets, or Kármán vortex streets, and these are repeating, oscillating vortex shedding occurrences of the flow behind the cylinder, and these can be actually seen in many things in the world, in the globe. We can see them in weather patterns, we can see them as the wind passes chimneys in power stations, and actually they can be quite damaging. They can create a lot of drag behind the cylinder. But we don't really see those at low Reynolds numbers in cycling because the wind speed is too high. And if we think about the typical wind speed we're looking at with a cyclist on a track, maybe 15 meters per second, and the size of their leg and everything, our Reynolds number we're interested in is actually in the kind of transition zone to turbulence. So we don't see these very regular vortex streets occurring, but we still get a large separation of the air at quite an early angle of the cylinder. At much higher Reynolds numbers and much higher airspeeds, we can actually see the vortex streets reappearing and they become regular and ordered again, and that'll increase the drag. But with any of these flow regimes, whatever point of Reynolds number you are or airspeed you are, you're always going to get drag behind the cylinder, and in the cylinder, to put it blunt, is quite a bad shape. So how can we improve the cylinder without actually touching it or doing anything to it, which would infringe the rules? Well, one very clever way to do it is to use something called a splitter plate. Now these can be attached to the back of the cylinder. At very low Reynolds numbers they can actually be in front of the cylinder, not even attached, and that keeps the two sides of the wake, which will have counter-rotating eddies in it, even if it's not a regular oscillating vortex street like a Kármán vortex street at a low Reynolds number, you'll still have, and TU Delft Technical University of Delft done a lot of work on this on cyclists. Even when you're in this kind of transitional or turbulent regime, you still have this wake, and in that wake are counter-rotating vortex pairs. Okay, they're not so ordered, they're not so repeatable, but you still get a drag from that, and it's quite damaging to the rider's bluff body, so all parts of the leg, hip and torso. Now, how can you reduce the interaction of those counter-rotating eddies? Well, use something called a splitter plate, and it doesn't even have to be attached to the back of the cylinder. And this is what I think Hope are doing with the seat stays on this bike. They are basically adding a remote splitter plate behind the cylinder, so the rider's legs, to help separate those counter-rotating eddies and reduce that drag that's set up by that wake and those vortices. And you can see that in this picture here I've taken from Delft University, the two different colours of the vorticity are showing that the rotation of the vorticity is in basically opposite directions, and it happens over every kind of cylindrical part of the bike and the rider's legs. So putting that splitter plate behind, although it is quite far back, because don't forget the rider's legs are rotating, putting it behind those rider's legs can reduce the drag, and putting one in front, maybe the fork, can reduce the drag as well. So an upstream splitter plate can also reduce the drag, although in this case I'm not so sure it's that effective, because I think the Reynolds number is way too high. The upstream splitter plate only seems to be very effective at a very low Reynolds number, so very thick fluid or very slow airspeed. I think the front forks are more to sort of manage the airflow between the wheel and the fork blade. I certainly think the seat stay is designed to be a detached aft splitter plate. Lotus, I think I read somewhere, claiming about 2 to 3% improvement in aero drag with this bike frame. Now, if you think about typical individual pursuit powers, that could be in the realms of something like 18 to 25 watts, and that's massive when you consider, you might fight for half a watt through a drivetrain improvement or skin suit or something like that. A rider's IP power, maybe 500-600 watts, that's huge. Now, another quick thing I want to mention about the Lotus bike and vortices, and again we see from this picture which Technical University of Delft have provided, they've done a lot of work with their life-size Tom Dumoulin 3D printed mannequin, and they've actually got something called robotic PIV, which is basically they use robots with laser scanners to image actual particles that are flowing and recirculating through the wind tunnel. And we can see one of these wakes right behind the rider's bum. It's actually one of the worst places. And you'll see on the track events, a lot of teams are using very long tails on the saddle, and even Primoz Roglic on his TT bike has cottoned onto this, and he's doing exactly the same. And that is basically kind of a splitter plate for the wake off the bum. So those long tail saddles, which haven't been banned yet, they're not there to be sat on. The rider never sit on that part of the saddle. It's there to act as a splitter plate to kind of separate those two counter-rotating vortex pairs behind the rider's bum, again to lower the drag a tiny bit. It's a tiny amount, but every little helps, and it's no weight penalty, it's not a structural penalty, so why not? Now, I just want to talk about something a little bit controversial that hasn't really been picked up in cycling media until now, really, is that there seems to be some prior art behind this method or this aero approach from Hope and Lotus that hasn't really been discussed, and it's from a guy called Richard McKinch, or Richard McKinch, I don't know, apologies if I pronounce your name wrong. But it wouldn't surprise me if when Hope or Lotus applied for a patent on this bike, the patent attorney said, sorry, there's prior art which is basically exactly the same thing, because have a look at this picture. Does that picture look like the Hope Lotus track bike? Do you think that's their patent? Okay, it does look like the Hope and Lotus track bike, almost identical, but it's not the Hope and Lotus drawing. It's a drawing from Mr. Richard McCainch, who is an ex, I think, F1 engineer and now actually works for a bicycle company. So I don't think this is being licensed to Lotus and Hope. I think there's a bit of controversy in who owns this IP. Like, he owns this IP, and I've gone through the patent. Now, I think he could have done a better job with the patent, or the patent lawyer could have done a better job, because the claims aren't specific enough. They really only talk about the fork legs diverting air in certain pathways. And there's nothing discussed about splitter plates, vortex management, Reynolds number, anything like that. Now, I think it's good enough to have any Hope or Lotus patent attempt blocked because of this prior art, and this has been worldwide granted now, it seems, but this has been around since 2016. So has this IP been kind of stolen by Hope and Lotus, or maybe it is being licensed out and maybe it's being settled? I don't know, but take a look at this. It looks exactly like the bike that we're seeing going around the track, and this was a patent applied for in, I think, 2016. So is this prior art worthy of, like, you know, should this prior art be commended, or and has it been licensed and that's all settled? Is the guy taking royalties? I don't know, but it's interesting that this ethos was thought about before, although it hasn't been thought about in the patent, at least, as kind of the splitter plate principle. But Hope and Lotus are doing it, and let's, fingers crossed, we'll see some good action on these bikes. But unfortunately, I still don't think we're going to get any like real definitive data out of it, because we're not getting Ganna ride his Pinarello and then Ganna ride this. But if someone wants to buy one and give it to Ganna, please do. GB did, I think, 4th today in the qualifiers for the team shoot, so seems to be working all right. Better than the Aussie one anyway. So see you in the next one.